Welcome to this video. In this video we are going to discuss the systemic granulomatous disease called sarcoidosis. Okay, so to begin with I want to discuss what do I actually mean when I say that sarcoidosis is a systemic granulomatous disease. So let me just write down that term and then we'll explore it in a bit more detail. So systemic granulomatous, spelt like so, disease. Okay, so hopefully you should be familiar with the meaning of the word disease, but just to remind you, a disease is a biopathological abnormality, so something that's abnormal within the body. Systemic, when we describe a disease as systemic, it means that it's not just going to affect one organ of the body. It's not going to be localized to one organ. Instead, it's going to affect a huge number of different organs within the body. Okay, so it's more of an entire body disease rather than a local disease of a single organ of the body. So, systemic disease, we've now understood that. The word in the middle is the most difficult word. Granulomatous, what does that mean? Well, put very simply, a granulomatous disease is one in which granulomas form in the tissues of the body. So a systemic granulomatous disease is one where you're going to get granulomas, whatever those are, forming all over the body. So sarcoidosis is a disease where you get these things, which I haven't told you really what they are yet, called granulomas forming all over the body. We will come on to what granulomas are in just a moment. But putting that aside for just a second, let me tell you about the prevalence of sarcoidosis. So how common is sarcoidosis? Well, of course, as with all diseases, the prevalence varies depending on where you are in the world. So depending on which portion of the world you're actually talking about, the prevalence will be different. However, the general figure for the prevalence of sarcoidosis is that it's around 1 in 10,000 people. Okay, so it's not the most common disease, but neither is it the most uncommon disease in the world. So 1 in 10,000 people will suffer from sarcoidosis. Now, of course, there are places in the world where the prevalence is higher, and to give two major examples, in Northern Europeans the prevalence is higher. So in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the prevalence of sarcoidosis is much higher, and also in African American populations the prevalence of sarcoidosis is generally higher as well. Okay, so there's a little bit on the epidemiology of sarcoidosis, but to stress, this disease is found all over the world. Okay, so it's a disease that affects the entire world. Now let's go back onto what is meant by a granuloma. So, granuloma, what is a granuloma? So firstly, let's just have a look at the word. So, oma, whenever you see a word with the suffix oma on the end, it means that this word is describing some sort of mass. So, oma on the suffix of a word means a mass of some sort. So it's often a suffix that you see on the end of the names of cancerous tumours. So sarcoma, carcinoma. However, it doesn't need to be a cancerous mass, and indeed granulomas are not cancerous masses. So oma just means mass. Do not confuse it for meaning cancerous mass. Okay, so a granuloma is some sort of mass. Now, these masses are generally roughly spherical, so just drawing a little picture of a granuloma. Here is a sphere. Of course, I've drawn a two-dimensional drawing here, but imagine a three-dimensional sphere. And the size of these granulomas can vary hugely. They can get up to sizes where they would actually be visible to the naked eye if you could see them. So they can get up to sizes of around 1 centimeter, as is roughly the size of this circle that I've drawn on the picture here. Or they can be very tiny and wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. So the sizes of these granulomas can vary hugely. So now the great question that we want to ask is, what actually is a granuloma made up of? And the answer is, it's made up of loads of cells of the immune system. Okay, so loads of white blood cells of the immune system is what a granuloma is made up of. Okay, so to summarize what we've learnt so far about sarcoidosis, it's this disease where you're going to get these structures known as granulomas forming in many different tissues of the body, and these granulomas are made up of collections of immune cells, and they can vary in how large they are, but they can get very large. Okay, next, where are we going to go next? We're going to now have a description of the different types of white blood cells that make up a granuloma. Now, in this description, I am just going to describe the structure of a granuloma to you. I am not going to explain yet how these granulomas are going to form, and I'm not going to explain why they actually form, what's the point of these things forming. We will come on to that later on, but for now I'm just going to give you a description of the cells that make up a granuloma. The other thing that it's worth me saying is that I'm going to give you the most basic description of the cells that make up a granuloma that is possible. Histopathologists found a huge number of different types of cells in these granulomas. I'm just going to give you the absolute basics, the major types of cells that you find in a granuloma that is needed for a basic understanding of what these things are, how they form, and what their purpose is. But if you do go and read a histopathologist's account of what a granuloma is, you'll find a huge, great long list of cells that I'm not going to mention that are also in granulomas, but I'm just going to give you the absolutely key ones that make up most of the granuloma. Okay, so let me draw a picture then, so that I can draw on the different cell types that are going to be found in a granuloma. So I'll start by drawing picture of the granuloma zoomed in on somewhat. Okay, so here's my granuloma zoomed in, and there are two major layers of a granuloma. There is the peripheral layer of cells, which I'm demarcating now, and then there is the core of the granuloma. So we're going to split the granuloma into two parts, the main core portion here, and then the periphery of the granuloma. And we're going to start from the outside and work our way inwards. So let's start out at the periphery then. What type of cell makes up the periphery of a granuloma? Well, I'm going to draw one much bigger than it would actually be. So this is completely out of scale. It would be much smaller than this compared to the entire granuloma. You'd have absolutely loads of these cells making up the thickness of the periphery here. But here is one exaggerated in size hugely. Okay, so we can see it's a nice round cell with a large nucleus, and in fact its nucleus is maybe a little bit small, so I'll make it a little bit bigger there. Okay, so a very large nucleus to cytoplasm ratio. Okay, and this cell is actually a type of a lymphocyte. So remember, granulomas are made up of white blood cells. Lymphocytes are a major type of white blood cell, and specifically this is a CD4 positive T helper 1 cell. So CD4 positive T helper 1 cell, and if you wish you could drop the CD4 positive and just put T helper 1 cell. If you put T helper 1 cell, then of course it's going to be a CD4 positive T cell. Okay, so we'll discuss where these CD4 positive T helper 1 cells are going to come from later on, but for now just know that the periphery of the granuloma is made up of CD4 positive T helper 1 cells. So you'll have absolutely loads of those. So I'll just now colour in the periphery in blue. So all of the periphery of the granuloma here is made up of CD4 positive T helper 1 cells. That's the major cell type that it's really important to know about that is present in the periphery of the granuloma. Okay, so what type of leukocyte or white blood cell is present then in the core of the granuloma? Well, the major type of white blood cell present in the core of the granuloma is macrophages. So the core of a granuloma is made up of loads and loads of macrophages. Now, a lot of the macrophages start differentiating into these specialized types of macrophages that I'll talk about in just a moment. But firstly, let me just draw on a basic macrophage. So remember, macrophages are great big blobs of cells that are a very powerful phagocytic cells, so they're capable of engulfing pathogens and breaking them down. So this cell here, which I'll outline in red, this is representing a macrophage. Now what I want to show you is some of the special types of cells that you can find in granulomas which come from macrophages. So a lot of the cells that are in the core of the granuloma, they come from macrophages. However, they are not actually macrophages. They are better than macrophages. They're these special types of macrophages. So from macrophages, we can create two specialized types of cells that you find in granulomas, but you'd be hard pushed to find elsewhere. So one is what's known as an epithelioid cell. So let me now show you an epithelioid cell. So these are even bigger versions of macrophages, so even more cytoplasm than a macrophage, like so. So this here, this is representing an epithelioid cell, and I'll stress again, these have come from macrophages. They are macrophages that have undergone a transformation process, and this transformation process is thought to be driven by all of the CD4 positive T helper 1 cells in the periphery of the granuloma. So these cells are very bossy. They love to shout commands at the macrophages in the core of the granuloma. They shout instructions at them and they give them commands, and they're believed to be the cells that cause the macrophages to become epithelioid cells. So here, this is an epithelioid cell. So what's the difference then between an epithelioid cell and a macrophage? Well, firstly, they're bigger than the macrophages. They have even more cytoplasm. Why are they called epithelioid cells? Well, the reason they're called epithelioid cells is that they look reasonably like squamous epithelial cells. So if you think about squamous epithelial cells, so for instance, to come up with a simple example, imagine the endothelial cells that line blood vessels. Those are incredibly thin cells, okay? But if you were to look at them from the inside of the blood vessel, so just drawing a basic picture of this. So let's say here is a blood vessel, okay, a nice tube, and you were to be a little man, let's say, and you're going into the inside of the blood vessel. So here you are, you're going to go inside the blood vessel and you're going to look at the epithelial cells, the endothelial cells, but of course endothelial cells are a type of epithelial cell. You were to look at the endothelial cells that line the inside of the blood vessel. What would they look like? Well, they'd actually look very like this. You'd see their nucleus and then you'd see their peripheral portions stretching out like so, and of course this would be extremely thin. So actually I'll just draw one of these over here. So this could be our epithelial cell that the little man would see if he was to go inside this blood vessel and look at the endothelial cells. So all of this portion would be the periphery of the endothelial cell, and it would be extremely thin. So it would be very squamous, but it would stretch out for a long region like so. Okay, so that's the reason that we call these special types of macrophages epithelioid cells, because when you're seeing just a two-dimensional cross-section of them, they look like these squamous epithelial cells from a certain angle. Now, of course, these are very different from these because this squamous epithelial cell would be extremely thin. If I was to poke my pen through here, it wouldn't take me long to get through to the other side, whereas with the macrophage, it's got a much fatter belly. Okay, so if I was to poke my pen through the macrophage, it would take me a lot longer to get through to the other side of the macrophage. But in a two-dimensional cross-section, they do look like these squamous epithelial cells. So that's the reason they're called epithelioid cells. The other reason they're called epithelioid cells is that they actually tend to join together with other epithelioid cells. So let me show another one here. So here's another epithelioid cell, here's another epithelioid cell, and they actually form these layers, these surfaces that are enclosing the center of the granuloma, like so, like an the skin of an onion it's often compared to. So these are all epithelioid cells. Now this is a two-dimensional cross-section. If I was able to show the three-dimensional structure, you should imagine this forming like the surface of a sphere. Okay, epithelioid cells making up the surface of a sphere, and then you'd have another layer of epithelioid cells making up a sphere effectively inside that, and inside that like the layers of an onion. So the core of the granuloma is made up of loads and loads of layers where you have these epithelioid cells connected together like so. So again, they form like an epithelium. Okay, that's another reason that they're called epithelioid cells. So really, that's an excellent description of a granuloma, that it's like the layers of an onion, where each of the layers is layers of epithelioid cells, and they're all trying to contain something right at the center. There's a little taster of the motivation for what these things are all about. They're about containing some horrible thing, or at least something that the body thinks is absolutely horrible, right at the center, to prevent it from spreading to other portions of the body. So in fact, most of the cells that you have in the core of a granuloma are not just plain old macrophages. They're these better versions of macrophages, these bigger, better versions known as epithelioid cells. And in fact, right at the center of the granuloma, we can get even bigger things than the epithelioid cells. So the other type of cell that macrophages can contribute to forming are what are known as multinucleated giant cells. And again, this is a type of cell that you'd be really hard pushed to find anywhere but in a granuloma. So multinucleated giant cells. Okay, so these, as the name suggests, multinucleated, they have multiple nuclei and they are giants of cells. So I'll try and put one in here. So just to paint the picture completely, or remind you of where we've got up to so far. So the outer portion of the granuloma is made up of T helper 1 cells. Then inside that we've got layers and layers of epithelioid cells, and occasionally dotted around you might see a few actual macrophages, but most of them will have become these epithelioid cells, forming layers and layers, okay, trying to contain something horrible at the center. So you have layers and layers of these surfaces of spheres. So imagine the surface of a sphere. So I'll just try and draw a picture of the surface of the sphere, and the surface of the sphere is made up by an interlinked meshwork of epithelioid cells. Okay, and you've got layer after layer of these epithelioid cells with intermingled macrophages, and then at some point at the center what you're going to find is these massive, great multinucleated giant cells. And again, this picture's slightly out of proportion. I've drawn these cells far too large for the size of the granuloma here. So here now, let's say this is a multinucleated giant cell. So you can see I've drawn it with 4 nuclei there, and I'll colour it in, not in red, I'll have it in green. Okay, so here it is, outlined in green, and it's made up of loads of macrophages that have all joined together. They've fused their cytoplasm together, fused their cell membrane together, and added their nuclei into the cytoplasm to form this giant of a cell. And this is now called a multinucleated giant cell. So at the center of the granuloma you get quite a few of these multinucleated giant cells formed, and they're at the center there. Okay, right, so those are the major cell types then of the core of the granuloma, and they're all derived from macrophages, these phagocytes of the immune system. Okay, the next thing that I want to do in my description of what a granuloma is describe to you what the difference, and let me just make sure this is in view, in fact I'll move this up a little bit, describe to you what the difference between a caseating and a non-caseating granuloma is. So these are words that you'll often see used if you're reading up about granulomatous disease. So you might even see sarcoidosis described as a systemic non-caseating granulomatous disease. So the granulomas that are formed in sarcoidosis are non-caseating granulomas. So what is meant by a caseating granuloma and what is meant by a non-caseating granuloma? Okay, so a caseating granuloma is one where at the centre of the granuloma you have a region where caseous necrosis has occurred to the cells. Okay, so this is right at the centre of the granuloma where this is going to occur. So we know that the core of a granuloma is made up of loads and loads of these macrophages and these cells that are very similar to macrophages, these bigger, better versions of macrophages. Okay, what can happen in certain granulomatous diseases? So with certain granulomas that form in certain granulomatous diseases, the granulomas can have a region right at the centre where the macrophages and these other cell types that are derived from macrophages are dying. Okay, they're being killed. And the way they die is known as caseous necrosis. And why is it known as caseous necrosis? Well, caseous means cheese in some language. I don't know which language it actually is. But caseous refers to cheese, and the reason this necrosis is called cheese necrosis is because when you actually look at it macroscopically, so you're not using a microscope here, you're looking at the centre of the granuloma with your eyes. So let's say we've got a visible granuloma, so let's say a massive great granuloma about 1 centimetre in diameter, and we've chopped it in half, so we've taken a cross section down the middle. We might have a centre here if it's a caseating granulomatous disease. So that if this is a caseating granuloma, we'll have a region where the cells are all dead. And that will look cheesy. It looks like cheese, so it looks pale, sort of yellowy, creamy colour, and it looks like cheese. And that's the reason that the granulomas are called caseating granulomas, because right at the centre they have this cheese-like appearance, and that is where the macrophages and these macrophage derivatives are dying. So in certain granulomas you have a region right at the centre where all the macrophages and all the macrophage derivatives, these cells here of the core of the granuloma, have died by a process known as caseous necrosis, and the macroscopic appearance of that is that it's like cheese. But know that the cells have been killed in some way. Necrosis, remember, is the bad way for cells to die. There are 2 ways that cells can die: apoptosis and necrosis. Apoptosis is planned cell death. This is where a cell commits suicide effectively, and it goes through a very organised process where it destroys itself and breaks itself up into loads of little pieces. So just drawing a little diagram out for this. Okay, here is the cell that's going to undergo apoptosis. It undergoes a very set process, a process that all cells have programmed into them and they can turn on. It's like a program that they have all got ready, and if they just press the button they initiate it, and what happens is they break themselves up into loads of little pieces like so. Okay, so this goes to this, and these little pieces are known as apoptotic bodies, and these apoptotic bodies can then be phagocytosed by other cells. So that's the process of apoptosis, and that's a very ordered process. That's where a cell has decided that it's best for the multicellular organism if it dies. Okay? Necrosis is the opposite. Necrosis is where this cell had absolutely no intention of dying and something killed it. Some pathogen potentially, or some poisonous chemical killed it. It destroyed its biochemical processes and the cell cannot now recover, but it did not go through this programmed process to break itself into little pieces. Okay, so necrosis is bad cell death, unplanned cell death, something killed those cells. So in caseating granulomas there's this region where these cells have died and they did not plan to die, and that portion of tissue where you've got all the remains of these cells that have died, it looks like cheese, so this type of necrosis is known as caseous necrosis. So that's what is meant by a caseating granuloma, and then quite simply a non-caseating granuloma is a granuloma where you do not have a centre where the cells are dying, and instead you just have a centre consisting of these macrophages and macrophage derivatives. So forget this and just continue this on. So you'd have lots of multinucleated giant cells here, and they'd all be very much so alive. So that's the difference between a caseating and a non-caseating granuloma. So sarcoidosis, the granulomas that form in sarcoidosis are generally of this second type. They are generally non-caseating. So if you were to find one that is large enough and chop it up, you generally find a core that doesn't have a region of caseous necrosis. However, that's not a hard and fast rule. Generally that's true. Some of the granulomas of sarcoidosis that you can find will actually have a little core of caseous necrosis. But generally we refer to the granulomas of sarcoidosis as non-caseating granulomas. Okay, so we'll have a break here. Let's just summarize what we have learnt in this video. So we have learnt what a granuloma is. We've just done a description of what a granuloma is at the moment. We've had a little bit of insight into what maybe these things are trying to do. I mean, it's hard to do a description without giving some insight into what these are trying to do. Okay, so we've seen how the periphery is made up of these CD4 positive T helper 1 cells, which are very bossy. They scream instructions in at the more stupid macrophages and macrophage derivatives in the center and tell them what to do. So they are the ones standing around the outside, away from whatever it is that's horrible at the center, screaming instructions at the cells that are more inside, closer to the center, closer to whatever it is that's horrible at the center, and they're telling them what to do to deal with this. And the center of the granuloma is made up of macrophages and these cells that are derived from macrophages, so epithelioid cells and multinucleated giant cells. And let me just stress that the major type of cell that's in the core of a granuloma is the epithelioid cell rather than the multinucleated giant cell, but you will have lots of macrophages intermingled around the place. And the epithelioid cells, these form these layers, like the layers of an onion skin. So the core of the granuloma is made up of layers and layers of epithelioid cells, where these epithelioid cells are all interlinked with one another to try and form a spherical surface to trap whatever horrors are in the center of the granuloma in there. And then as we approach the center, you'll find these multinucleated giant cells, which are derived from lots of macrophages that have fused together. Granulomas can be either caseating or non-caseating. In the non-caseating granulomas, that's our description finished. In the caseating granulomas, right at the center of the core of the granuloma, you will have a region of caseous necrosis where the cells are dying for some reason. Whatever the horrible thing at the center of these granulomas is, it is killing the cells. So you've got caseous necrosis, and this type of necrosis looks like cheese when you see it macroscopically. It doesn't look like cheese when you look at it microscopically. Okay, it looks like those are dead cells when you look at it microscopically. Okay, so sarcoidosis is going to be a whole body disease where we're going to get these granulomas, which are generally non-caseating granulomas, although some of them occasionally can have a region of caseous necrosis at the center, forming in many different tissues of the body. In the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you which tissues of the body these non-caseating granulomas can form generally form in sarcoidosis. They can form in pretty much every tissue all around the body, but there are certain tissues where they nearly always form and other tissues where they hardly ever form. And I'm going to go over the major tissues where they commonly can form in sarcoidosis.